Joe Theismann thinks that the Washington Commanders should not and will not play Jayden Daniels this preseason. And I got to tell you, we love Joe, but I got to disagree. Also, I kind of got to agree. That and more coming up on today's episode of Locked On Commanders.
You are Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, David Harrison, credential member of the media covering the Washington Commanders for CommanderGameDay.com. Here with you every Monday through Friday. Greatly appreciate you coming through today. Everydayers, welcome back. I appreciate you for coming through every single day. This is your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders. If you haven't already, please subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you are listening to this episode. And on today's episode, we are going to discuss the linebacker position, long neglected in Washington, finally at the forefront again and getting a whole lot of shine from some NFL greats, some former legends of your current legends, former members of the Washington football franchise. History potentially repeating itself, potentially bringing itself back. We'll talk about the latest developments in returning some of the Washington history to the present. But first, we're going to start with Joe Theismann, great Washington quarterback in franchise history, Super Bowl winning quarterback at that, talking about whether or not the Washington Commanders should and will play Jayden Daniels this preseason. If you want to discuss that, anything in this episode or anything else Washington Commanders related, all you got to do is send me a text message. And all you got to do that is go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. Become an insider today. And from there, you can text me your questions, your thoughts, your analysis, your opinions. Of course, you're going to get plenty of mine. You're also going to get bonus content, inside information, and live text from games, practices, press conference, and the like. So do all that, get all that content. No hashtags, no apps, no filters. You text me, I text you. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders to make it happen today. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create your account, use a promo code LOCKEDONNFL, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Joe Theismann recently went on the Craig Hoffman Show, popular Washington, D.C. radio show podcast. If you haven't heard of it, if you haven't, check it out, search it up. Craig Hoffman does a very good job. He's out there in Ashburn quite often as well, so he's definitely a guy who's boots on ground, plugged in to the organization, so make sure you check that out. But anyway, Joe Theismann goes on the Craig Hoffman Show. Craig asks him myriad of questions, but at one point starts asking him about the evaluation of Jayden Daniels, what he thinks about the young quarterback and all those things. And of course, Joe goes into a very logical conversation about how it's really kind of too early to know if he's going to be great or amazing, anything like that. Says he likes what he's seen, likes what he knows, got the chance to talk to the young guy, likes talking to him, all those things. But really, it's just kind of too early to mail the evaluation card in and really put a grade on what Jayden Daniels is going to be. However, he started off his whole conversation, which very logical conversation, started off the entire conversation by saying the Washington Commanders will not and should not play Jayden Daniels. I'm paraphrasing there. The actual quote that Joe Theismann said is, Jayden Daniels, he isn't and shouldn't play in the preseason. And of course, that piqued a lot of ears. That got a lot of interest. And I got to say, I don't agree that he won't play in the preseason, but I do agree with Joe Theismann's opinion or logic as to why maybe he shouldn't play in the preseason. So let's really kind of get down to the nitty gritty into this whole thing. Again, Theismann saying he isn't and shouldn't play in the preseason. And then he goes on to say, quote, so if he isn't going to play in the preseason, how are we going to be able to understand how good he is when he's got people around his feet and it's a different world, end quote. So basically talking about until you see the kid in real life NFL competition, not practice competition, not preseason, or not even preseason competition, to be quite honest with you, but regular season competition, you're not going to be able to really judge how good he is. And again, Joe says we're not going to see that until week 1 in Tampa. And even then, week 1 in Tampa, Joe said it's going to be kind of a glorified preseason game because it's going to be their first 60 minutes on a field together, the entirety of the starting unit. It's going to be your first time playing in that kind of a heat and all these things. So football conditioning, you said the only way you get in football condition shape is to play football. So you're going to kind of see that there as well. But Craig did what he should do and what every responsible journalist hopefully would do, and that is to follow up, because the way that it was stated by Joe kind of sounded like Joe knows something and Joe's kind of sharing something on the air here. But in reality, it was just more so Joe's opinion as to what should or will happen as well. But in the follow-up, Joe Theismann also said, quote, why would you put your quarterback out there? He followed that up by saying they would tear head coach Dan Quinn apart if Jayden Daniels got hurt in the preseason. And certainly there's some potential there, right? I mean, if it's like his second snap on the field and he gets hurt, I would hope that fans wouldn't necessarily, try to pull out the pitchforks and all that stuff. But let's be honest, now that this has been put out there in the stratosphere, now that Joe Theismann has said this, now if Jayden Daniels goes out there, now Jayden Daniels gets hurt, knock on wood that doesn't happen, now people are going to tear Dan Quinn apart because they're going to say, Joe Theismann told you shouldn't put him out there and all those things. But at the end of the day, Joe Theismann doesn't make that decision, obviously. Here's my opinion on it, right? And this is purely opinion. Again, no plugged in facts, no inside information, nothing like that. And it's just pure opinion, just like Joe Theismann was coming out with. Joe obviously coming from an aspect of experience, having played the game, also observing the game. I'm obviously coming from a standpoint of being a competitor in a previous life and also observing the game for decades now. So my opinion is this. The Washington Commanders will play Jayden Daniels in the preseason. Now, how much should they play Jayden Daniels in the preseason? So if we go off of the premise, I don't believe that Jayden Daniels is not going to take a single preseason snap. However, where I will get in line with Joe Theismann's line of thinking, which I agree with his line of thinking anyway, but where I'll kind of minimize the amount that I think or hope, I guess you should say, Jayden Daniels plays in the preseason, is that I think he should play one series in the preseason. One series. And that should come in the final preseason game against the New England Patriots. So here's to me the ideal preseason for Jayden Daniels. Obviously, he's going to go through training camp, right? But truthfully, there's not a lot of reason, and that's what Joe Theismann is saying. He said another part, like what's the risk and reward factor of this? There's not a lot of reward for the risk of playing Jayden Daniels against the New York Jets or against the Miami Dolphins. And I know fans at home watching on TV, you're going to want to see Jayden. You're going to want to see your number 2 overall pick. I got you. I get it. I hope for your sake that the Jets and the Dolphins are streaming these joint practices so you can at least see that. But every coach will tell you, and every coach that I've ever talked to about joint practices has told me that the preseason game after the joint practices is not near as valuable as the joint practice themselves. Even a one-day joint practice session, because you're going to get looks, or you can get looks. Like you can ask the New York Jets to throw more at your rookie quarterback in a joint practice, because it's not televised, because it's not something that every other team is going to be able to go out there and get their hands on, which is kind of why I think it limits the streaming a little bit, because teams tend to unroll a little bit more and throw a little bit more at their opponent during these joint practices, because they have the advantage of it's not going to be on broadcast tape. It's not going to be on all 22 for everybody to see, but we can film it. We can get the all 22 and really kind of break it down and see how an opponent reacted to it. So for that reason, what you're most likely going to see is more valuable reps for Jayden Daniels against the New York Jets in the joint training practice and against the Miami Dolphins in the joint training practice. But you're going to do it in a controlled environment where he can't get hit, and therefore minimizes the opportunity for him to get injured, obviously, very significantly. Because of that, there's not a lot of risk reward in starting him or playing him against the Jets or the Dolphins. The Patriots, however, there's no joint practices there. And for me, where the value is coming in and playing football is always playing football, right? But there's a difference between waking up in the morning, knowing you're starting, coming to the stadium, getting ready as a starter, getting fresh as a starter, getting dressed as a starter, leading the team onto the field as a starter, and starting the game with the ball. If I'm the Washington Bears, I'm praying that we win the coin toss. We elect to receive. We put Jayden out there for one series, and we pull him off. Let's just get through the opening game process. Here's what this looks like. Let's script our plays. Let's go through this whole thing, so that week 1 against Tampa, that's not a new experience. That's really my biggest thing for why Jayden Daniels should maybe play one series against the New England Patriots. After that, however, get him off. And what I really like is Joe Theismann's an old head, right? He's an older dude. And a lot of times the older generations, they come from a generation of you need 1,000 reps to become an expert, or whatever, 2,000, whatever it is, to become an expert. So get as many reps as you can. Get as many reps as you can. Preseason reps, training camp reps, all the reps. You want all the reps. Never get off the field. But what research has really shown, and I could go into a whole kind of side angle on this whole thing, but it's not the amount of practice you do or training you do. It's the quality of the practice and of the training you do. And like I said, the quality of the practice and training in the joint practices against the Jets and Dolphins is going to be much better than the quality of practice Jayden Daniels is going to get in the actual preseason game. For that, I agree completely with Joe. Do not want to see Jayden Daniels on the field in the preseason weeks 1 and 2 against the Jets and the Dolphins. But I do expect the Commanders to play him at least a little bit. So if you're going to play him a little bit, I think starting off week 3 against New England Patriots, let him get in there, start the game, take the team onto the field. Plus, you're going to be at home, or not FedEx, but that Commanders Field crowd would love to see Jayden run out the tunnel in front of the team. That's when you do it. Let him go one series. I don't care. 3 and out, interception, fumble, touchdown, whatever it is, get him off the field. That's my opinion on that. So we're catching up on news today. Next up, we're going to talk about history history repeating itself, but could be a signal of history coming back. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Commanders brought to you by Game Time. And Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which means your tickets or your ability to get tickets to baseball games has just gotten faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer that it gets to first pitch. They've got killer last minute deals that save you up to 60% on the app, all in prices. So there's no surprises at checkout. Views from your seat so you know what you're going to see when you get to the venue. And they've got their lowest price guarantee. So Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying your Major League Baseball tickets. The next Washington Nationals home game, July 19th. If you want to see them host the Cincinnati Reds in that game, you can do it for as little as $18. And like I said, typically it's going to go down the closer we get to first pitch. If you just can't wait that long, New York Yankees are in the DMV facing the Baltimore Orioles. So you can go to Game Time and get tickets for that as well. So take the guesswork out of buying your Major League Baseball tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create your account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL to get 20% off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create your account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Catching up on the news as we get another week of Locked On Commanders programming rolling for you. You may remember the Montana Senator, Senator Daniels, who was threatening to block the bill that would approve the would approve Washington, D.C. getting a lease for the land that RFK Stadium currently sits on for 99 years. And that would, of course, open the door and the possibility that the new Washington Commanders Stadium could be located on that same property. Senator Daniels out of Montana threatened to block that block that possibility, unless the organization returned to recognizing the history of the organization and Native Americans in the state of Montana specifically. He was back at it on Twitter last week. So we're going to talk about that here in just a second. Thanks for making Locked On Commanders your first listen, your first view today, every single day, every day. Thanks for coming through for this episode. We've got 4 more episodes this week. We are 5 days a week all throughout the year, as much as possible. So make sure you come back for that. In the meantime, between episodes, if you need more sports, check out Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories. So make sure you're checking that out for free on YouTube or on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So again, Senator Steve Daniels out of Montana, and that's kind of the weird part of this. Like, why is the senator out of Montana so invested or so concerned with what's going on with the Washington Commanders branding and renaming it and all that stuff? Well, the bottom line is that Montana is where the Blackfeet tribe, a lot of it is housed in the state of Montana. And that's basically what this comes down to, is he's trying to protect the best interests of Blackie Wetzel, the Wetzel family. Of course, the old Washington football logo featuring Blackfeet Chief, 2 Guns, White Calf. That's kind of the whole thing, is that the logo, in this discussion of team name changes and all these other things, like, it's about respect and it's about, the exploitation of other peoples and everything else. And is it right to do it? And in what form is it right to do it in? And of course, Washington's football team was not the only pro sports franchise that has been kind of pressured to change the logos, change the names, all those things. And essentially what Senator Daniels says he's looking for is not a return to the former team name. And I know that makes a good amount of the fan base unhappy as well. But what he wants is a return of the logo. So a return of the logo, change the team name to something that more resembles that logo. Because honestly, if you go back to that logo, I don't think you can keep Washington Commanders as the name. It's just the history of what the word commander means and associated with, and the history of the Blackfeet and just American, Native Americans in this country and the history there. I don't think the two really kind of marry up all that well. So you got to change the name, whether it be Washington Natives or Washington Warriors, something to that effect, but bring back the old logo and change the name to something more fitting. Don't bring back the old name. That's not what Senator Daniels is after. And the reason we're talking about this is Senator Daniels was at it again this past week on Twitter, sending out a tweet that said, quote, "Refreshing to see the NFL once again proudly displaying the legendary logo envisioned by Montana in Blackie Wetzel and inspired by Blackfeet Chief, 2 Guns, White Calf. Big change from earlier this year when the logo was unnecessarily censored. Let's restore the logo to a place of pride. And what Senator Daniels is talking about, and I never noticed this, to be quite honest with you, on Twitter. I didn't put these things together. So it's interesting that Senator Daniels in his office was able to put this together. But in February, the NFL sent out a series of tweets with images of past Super Bowl champions. One of them celebrating Washington for winning the Super Bowl with Doug Williams at quarterback. Another one celebrating the Hogs and Washington winning a Super Bowl with John Riggins. There's even a banner on there that says John Riggins breaks loose for a 43-yard touchdown to put Washington ahead for good. And there's strategically, quote unquote, pieces of confetti placed over the Washington helmet to mask the logo. So obvious attempt by the NFL to mask the logo. But then in June, at the end of June, the NFL's Twitter account tweeted out a video, says any Santana Moss enjoyers on the timeline, and tagged Santana Moss in it, of course. And it's just a bunch of Santana Moss highlights. And obviously the helmet he's wearing is front and center in full view. So Senator Daniels kind of saying, you know, it's you're seeing the NFL kind of shift its stance on whether or not to broadcast or display the logo, the old logo. And of course that supports his cause of trying to restore the old logo to the franchise, even if the name is not going to come along with it. So interesting development there on that front. And of course, it comes in the exact same week that the Washington Commanders, the franchise itself, unveils that they are returning the gold pants to the Washington uniform rotation. Gold pants haven't been worn by a Washington football team since 2018. So now those gold pants that are so historically connected to that former logo, that former team name, all that history, all those highlights coming back, the Washington Commanders will wear gold pants this season. So there's already a part of history coming back. And again, Josh Harris made no qualms about it. He grew up a fan of this franchise. He grew up with memories of walking into RFK Stadium, doing all those things. So this is a managing partner of this ownership group that absolutely understands the fan base, understands the history of the team, the connection between the history and its fan base, and obviously is doing things that he can to bring parts of that history back. So if the NFL is starting to get on board, you pretty much already know Josh Harris is on board, right? Like I'm not putting words in his mouth. I'm just saying from the actions, from his own previous statements, you kind of know that Josh Harris is pretty much on board. You know, I'm not saying it's going to happen. Just saying, you know, it's not never going to happen either. The name, don't think that's ever coming back. But the logo, potentially, and certainly Senator Daniels is going to continue the battle to get the logo returned. So Commanders fans, I know it's not everything you want, but I think it's a good amount of what you want. And hopefully it could be good enough, at least if it is able to happen. So a little bit of history repeating itself, history coming back into the present, and potentially a push for more history to be returned to the Washington franchise. And up next, we're going to talk about linebackers. You got some historic linebackers that have suited up for Washington in the football days of past. One of those being London Fletcher. London Fletcher among the Washington alumni who are extremely excited about the new crop of linebackers coming into Washington, specifically Bobby Wagner and Frankie Louvu. That coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. If you're like a lot of people, you might from time to time compare yourself, compare your life to others and to the lives of other people. And it's perfectly natural to do it. Of course, social media plays a big part of that because people are putting the best parts of their life out there. And sometimes if you're going through a rough patch, you're looking at it, you're saying, man, why can't my life be like theirs? And doing so, honestly, can create a barrier for yourself to see the positives in your own life. Comparison can be a thief of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives and lose track of the good going on in your own. Well, therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. It's helpful to learn positive coping skills and how to set boundaries, and empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it isn't just for those who have experienced major traumas in their life. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. Just fill out a brief questionnaire. You'll get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time if you need to for no additional cost. So stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Commanders, starting off the week, catching up on news from the week before. We're doing our position group by position group breakdown coming out of OTAs and mini camps, talking about what we think we know, what we knew about the Washington Commanders. If you missed that whole series, it was all defense last week. Head back, check that out. You can also check out the interview with offensive tackle Alex Akingbulu. We did offense the week prior to that, so a lot of content over this quote-unquote dead period if you want to catch up with everything we've been talking about. But of course, there were things happening while we were talking about those things. So we're going to catch up on those. And specifically, there was an episode of Get Up. Is that what it's called? Yeah, it's called Get Up, which is a Washington Commanders in-house media production. It's hosted by Michael Jenkins. In this particular episode, London Fletcher, Washington legend, was on the program. Fred Smoot, former Washington cornerback, was on the program. And they started talking about some of the changes going on in the organization, specifically to the linebacker room. And the linebacker room really just this offseason has gotten a big boost, has gotten a big amount of attention, and it's getting a lot of reaction from the national media. And coming off of an era where you had a former NFL linebacker head coach, a former NFL linebacker defense coordinator, to see the linebacker position neglected the way that it was. And I know they spent a first-round pick on the position group, but outside of that one first-round pick, not a lot of resources put into the linebacker room. It was just kind of weird. It was just kind of weird to see two former NFL linebackers coach this team and this team's defense and minimize the position as much as they did. Well, obviously, that is not happening with this new group. Bobby Wagner's in, Frankie Louvu's in. They spent a draft pick on Jordan McGee. They're looking for new ways to get Jayden Daniels involved. And something that London Fletcher said about Bobby Wagner on the program was, quote, future Hall of Famer, perennial Pro Bowler, perennial All-Pro. He still brings playmaking ability even at 34 years old. Before that, he said, quote, man, you talk about instant credibility. What a difference a year makes in terms of where our linebackers were last year. One of the worst in the league. And then this year, number one by some people, end quote. And again, I kind of flipped the order of the quotes in there, but that's basically everything that London Fletcher said. Not everything, but a good portion of what he said. But I mean, you couldn't be more right. You know, Bobby Wagner, look, he's 32 years old. It wouldn't be, or he's 34 years old. Sorry, London was 32 when he came to Washington from Buffalo. There wouldn't be a lot of hate out there for people trying to say, well, Bobby Wagner kind of, you know, he's not really the Bobby Wagner of old. And certainly there have been some people who said, like, he doesn't look like the same Bobby Wagner that everybody kind of fell in love with. You know, the Bobby Wagner is going to make him a Hall of Famer is not the same Bobby Wagner that you're getting right now. But when you understand the reasons that Washington brought Bobby Wagner onto the roster, is not just for his playability, which there's still plenty of, but it's also his leadership ability, his coach on the field mentality, and all these things. He's going to help Frankie Louvu, Jordan McGee, Jayden Daniels, Anthony Pittman, all these guys, Bo Bauer. He's going to help all these guys become better linebackers just because of his presence. And if Frankie Louvu really kind of is the heir apparent, I mean, he's the only free agent they brought in the position that's got more than a 1 year deal. He's going to need to learn a lot from Bobby Wagner on how to be that leader in the locker room, how to be that leader on the field. And Frankie certainly has some leadership ability of his own. He was a captain with the Carolina Panthers as well. But I think that term instant credibility really kind of encapsulates what Bobby Wagner's arrival to Washington did. Because remember, this is a franchise that not just outsiders, but also some of the fans, some of the media here, we're talking about this organization as, why would any free agent want to come here? Why would any big name player want to make Washington a stop in their career? And boom, just and really in one offseason, right? Josh Harris starts with Adam Peters. They go to Dan Quinn. They bring in this amazing coaching staff. They bring in guys like Bobby Wagner, Zach Ertz, who have respect around the league. And all of a sudden, it's like, why wouldn't Washington be a place that people want to go? Brandon Ayuk, if you want to get traded from these Super Bowl contending San Francisco 49ers, why wouldn't you want to come to Washington? Certainly Jayden Daniels has a part of that too, but nobody's looking at that going and scoffing and saying like Brandon Ayuk is going to go from the San Francisco 49ers to the Washington Commanders, get out of here. No, now it's like, okay, yeah, it could actually happen, and it could be something that actually potentially works. So it just really is just this huge shift in approach. And it was really interesting too, is that Fred Smoot goes on and really kind of compares the arrival of Bobby Wagner this year to when London Fletcher arrived back when he came over again from Buffalo. And Fred Smoot said, quote, when London came into the locker room, he brought more than just a football player. He was El Capitan. He brought in the leader, somebody to set the tone, somebody to set the pace. And again, that just explains Bobby Wagner all in just one fell swoop, right? But Bobby, not the only linebacker getting love from this duo, from this legendary duo of Washington alumni. Frankie Louvu also getting some love in the Get Up podcast. And again, it's all in the same episode. So if you want to go listen to it, it's a really great episode, really great interview. And what I really loved is Fred Smoot in one of his quotes. I'm going to read the whole thing, but my favorite part of it, quote, he's like a rolling ball with knives sticking out of it. That's how he described Frankie Louvu. So here's the whole quote, not just the energy, not just the intensity, not just knowing where to be. He looked the part, he plays the part, and I can't wait to see him being part of some organized chaos. He's like a rolling ball with knives sticking out of it. I just can't wait to see him go downhill. London Fletcher recounted an encounter he had with D'Angelo Hall, again, another former Washington player. Now he's a coach in Carolina. He was a coach in Carolina last year, so we got to know Frankie there. And London Fletcher said, quote, he said about D'Angelo Hall, Fletch, you're going to love him. You're absolutely going to love him. He's my type of player. He's our type of player. And then London continued saying he really sets the tone. Just looking at the tape, him as a blitzer, he was their best pass rusher, best blitzer for the Panthers last year. And that's one of the elements he brings to this defense, the physical intensity, end quote. And, when we did our linebacker breakdown, our group breakdown, we talked about a lot of that stuff. We talked about a lot of that potential as well. But to hear London Fletcher, hear Fred Smoot seeing the same thing, understanding the same thing, getting that same vibe, just kind of reassures the excitement that you have about this group. It's not going to single-handedly turn the defense around. You're still going to obviously need the secondary. You're still going to need the pass rush. But it's great to see the linebacker group getting addressed finally by this organization after so long when it wasn't addressed. And again, confusingly so, maybe frustratingly so, left unaddressed. And now all of a sudden, again, to certain, I think Mike Clay of ESPN had this linebacker core as the number one linebacker group in the National Football League, when last year it was probably 27th, 28th, if not dead last in the NFL. So good things to hear from London Fletcher and Fred Smoot. Again, that was on the Get Up podcast, part of the Washington Commanders in-house media products. One of them that they do, several in-house products they do a good job of. And that's going to wrap up this week. That was last week of news. We're caught up on pretty much everything. Joe Theismann saying Jayden Daniels shouldn't play in the preseason, the return of some history with the gold pants coming back, but Senator Daines out of Montana still pushing to bring even more history back to this franchise, and then some light being shined down on the linebacker group. Good way to get this week started. We've got more coming up this week, so everydayers, make sure you come back tomorrow. We're going to get into some rankings. We're going to talk a little bit of fantasy football. Somehow, there are some fantasy football leagues that draft before training camp. To me, it's absolutely insane, but they do it, so we are going to get a jump on some fantasy football conversation. In the meantime, if you've got questions or comments, throw them in the YouTube comment section or text me directly by going to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. Don't forget to check out Locked On Sports Today, the first ever 24/7 live streaming sports channel on YouTube. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Commanders your first listen or your first view today and every day, everydayers. Thanks for coming through like you do. Until we speak again, if you're out and about, please be safe, be kind. We will see you next time for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.